everyone. My name is Virgo, and I am an author and mental health campaigner. So I spend my time working a lot with schools, corporates, universities, colleges, and then also do a lot of work with the government in the UK. So I predominantly look at issues around eating disorders and disordered eating and exercise, but also looking a little bit more broadly at that kind of entire spectrum of mental health. So getting people to really talk about things, getting people to really understand about their own well-being, but also making sure that when people do reach out for that support, that they're met in the right way from those people around them. So we've got about 25 minutes today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a little bit of a context setting. I'm then going to talk to you a little bit about my own experience. And then after that, share a couple of top tips on how you guys can all really manage your own relationship with food, with exercise, and again, more broadly, your mental health as well. Some of the content that we will be covering today is slightly sensitive. It might resonate with some of you. So I would really, really encourage you, if it is something that is resonating or something that kind of triggers a certain reaction, please do reach out and get that support from someone around you as well. So just looking a little bit at some of the stats at the moment, and I'm sure that you will have seen the kind of huge increase in the number of people who are currently struggling with an unhealthy relationship with food, an unhealthy relationship with exercise, but also the amount of people who are really struggling with their own self-worth, their own self-esteem, and their own bodies. When we look at the statistics, we currently know that there are 16% of adults at any one time screening positive for an eating disorder. We know when we look at young people that we've had a fourfold increase in hospital admissions for eating disorders. But looking more broadly at that, we do know that more and more people are struggling on a day-to-day basis with their well-being and with understanding their own bodies and what they need. Eating disorders have the highest mortality rate out of any psychiatric illness. And whilst not every single person who goes through bad body image or goes through issues around their own self-worth and identity develops an eating disorder, there are some real intrinsic links there. So often when we think of eating disorders, we still imagine that white teenage emaciated girl. But we know that eating disorders do not just have one particular look, but actually they can present in all different body sizes, all different shapes. They can present in both males and females, and they can present from people with all different races, from all different backgrounds. When we look at the statistics, we know that only 6% of people with an eating disorder will ever fall into that underweight category. So that means you've got this 94% cohort of people who never really get into that underweight bracket. So there's a high chance that they will never, ever get that support. Eating disorders are still extremely stigmatized. They're often thought of as a diet, as a lifestyle choice, as something that someone chooses, or that's something that someone does to look a certain way or to be a certain type of person. But they are very, very serious mental illnesses, and they are extremely complicated in the causes and then consequently in how to treat them as well. I mentioned a moment ago that we've seen this huge rise in the number of people currently struggling with an eating disorder. And we know at the moment that seeking support can feel really, really challenging. What was already a really, really overrun and kind of broken system before COVID-19 hit, it's now a system that just cannot function when it comes to looking after people with eating disorders. This is not the fault of the NHS, but it's a much wider systemic issue. It's issues around funding, it's that lack of understanding. But because of these kind of root issues within services, it means that there are so many people who are just not able to get that support. And a lot of this fuels that stigma and the stereotypes around eating disorders, that you have to have a particular look to have an eating disorder. Again, stopping so many people reaching out for that support. When we think about the things that cause eating disorders and affect more broadly our self-esteem and our self-worth, it can get extremely complicated. Just kind of picking out a couple of things for you guys to really think about today. So firstly, thinking about COVID-19, thinking about the pandemic, this kind of huge period of uncertainty that we've all been living through for the last 2 years, that uncertainty and the isolation. And whilst that doesn't necessarily cause an eating disorder, we do know that in some situations, lockdowns just created this perfect storm for people with eating disorders. We know that eating disorders really, really thrive in those periods of uncertainty and isolation, using them as a chance, like other addictions, to kind of pull that person in, offering them that false sense of security, that false sense of reassurance. We've also had a huge increase on the messaging around exercise and on obesity and on healthy eating as well over the last couple of years. And again, whilst this might seem really harmless, for people with eating disorders, it can be really, really triggering, but also it can have a detrimental impact. In fact, we know that 25% of people who start calorie counting will go on to develop an eating disorder. And 35% of those people will spend the rest of their lives with a dysfunctional relationship with food. If you're someone who's maybe looking into calorie counting, or maybe you started doing it yourself, I would really, really encourage you to really think about what that is doing for you. Is it actually serving a purpose and being part of your life in a positive way? Or is it stopping you going out and doing things? Is it stopping that spontaneity, that relationship building, that making memories with your friends? We have also seen a huge number of people recently really struggling with their body image. And the research shows that actually a lot of this is linked to the fact that people have spent a huge amount of time on video calls and on social media. I feel like lots of us, when we're on video calls, spend that entire time kind of scrutinizing our own faces, kind of judging ourselves, comparing ourselves to those people around us. And again, whilst it might seem like a really harmless thing to be doing, and you might not even always be aware that you're doing that or that you're body checking all the time, because of this kind of obsession with our bodies now, people are actually getting really, really affected. And on top of that, we've had this increase in the amount of modern societal ideals, these pressures to look a certain way, that narrative, again, that we tell ourselves that in order to be happy, we have to look a certain way, to be a certain type of person, that in order to be happy and healthy, we have to be thin. And we all know that that is really, really unscientific in itself. But because we're spending so much time putting that pressure on ourselves, it can get very, very difficult to navigate. And then the final thing just to be aware of, particularly given the last year, is the amount of people who have eating disorders, or again, that kind of dysfunctional relationship with food, who have actually been through trauma. The statistics show that 70% of people with an eating disorder have been affected by trauma. But trauma doesn't have to be something that's like being in a volcano or being in a car crash. It could be anything to that person. And if you're someone who's been through a situation where maybe you felt that it's been traumatic for you, and in fact, actually all of us living through a pandemic, it's been fairly traumatic in places, just being aware that actually you need to give yourself that space and that time to really process about it. So just a little bit more about me before I share some kind of top tips on really managing your own well-being and managing all of this kind of self-worth and things like that as well. So I developed anorexia when I was about 12, 13 years old. The reason that I developed an eating disorder was I was finding life very, very difficult at that point. I'd grown up with quite a dysfunctional family, kind of taking on the role in my family as the fixer, trying to kind of navigate all of these situations, trying to make sure that everyone was okay, and constantly not allowing my needs to be met, kind of pushing myself further back, all of those things that I really wanted. On top of that, when I was 12, 13 years old, I was also sexually abused for around 8, 9 months. And throughout that whole period of time, I didn't talk to anyone about it. I felt really guilty and really embarrassed about it. When it finished, the man went off, got married. And I just thought because he'd moved on with his life, that actually I had to find a way to move on with my life. I had to find a way to deal with all of these differing emotions that were going on. But I had absolutely no idea how to do that. I had no idea how to talk about things, but I also was too nervous and too ashamed to actually start having these conversations. The other thing that happens so often when someone has been through some form of abuse is they're left with these feelings. There is something categorically wrong with who they are, and that's why this happened. But you do not have to go through abuse to feel that way. It could be a comment that someone makes in the playground growing up. It could be a comparison that maybe your parents have made between you and a sibling. It could be something that someone jokes around with you about, or a comment that maybe felt really harmless to someone else. It's kind of still sitting in there. Those words that have been spoken over you have become so imprinted and labeled on you that you're finding it really hard to get away from them. And you're constantly sitting with that rumination and going back to that narrative that there's something wrong with me. And this is why this keeps happening, or this is why that happened. And for me, I really, really struggled with all of those emotions. And I had to find a way to deal with it. And for me, that came out in the form of calorie counting, kind of restricting my food intake, but also obsessive exercise. And it was quite literally like having this voice in my head. It told me what I should eat, what I should drink, and how much exercise I should do. And the more I listened to that voice in my head, the better I felt about every single thing going on around me. It helped to numb all of those emotions, all of those things that I didn't want to feel. It helped me to feel this real sense of value and certainty. And the narrative kept telling me that if I just kept doing this, it would make everything feel okay. I was convinced during that period in my life that the more I focused on food, the more exercise I did, the better life would be, and that somehow everything would work itself out. But what so often happens when you have a dysfunctional relationship with food is you kind of lose sight of all of that stuff that is going on around you. And I completely lost sight of not only who I was, but actually the fact that what I was doing was really, really dangerous and really, really toxic. I managed to hide this from every single person around me for the next 4 years. I lied an awful lot throughout my teens, kind of rebelling constantly, just constantly wanting to be out the house, kind of just being out of the way at meal times. Over that 4 years, though, what happened was that voice in my head that had made me happy for so long gradually began to kind of berate me even more. I wasn't doing enough for it. I wasn't succeeding enough at what it wanted me to do. And it got to the point after my GCSEs, when I went away with my school friends, that I realized that I was in this real battleground in my head. It was like I could either eat and drink and get involved, but if I did that, I'd be sitting with all of this guilt afterwards, and it wasn't really worth it. There'll be some of you maybe today who have that guilt and anxiety around food, that every time you sit down to a meal, you get so preoccupied with what you're having in front of you that you're not really able to concentrate on any other conversation around you. Or maybe you finish a mealtime and every single time you're sitting with that guilt and that shame and that uncertainty again, and you don't know how to deal with it. Maybe like me, you think the best solution is to completely isolate yourself from those people around you, to kind of just cut them off, cut those situations off so you don't really have to deal with them. But that is not a long-term solution to any of this. And for me, I had to realize there was so much else actually going on that I wanted to be part of. You fast forward though through that 4-year period, and eventually my school did get in touch with my mum. I went to my doctor, and then I was finally referred to the Children's Adolescent Mental Health Services, so CAMS. I'm sure that some of you will have had experiences of CAMS, whether it's you yourselves directly or whether it's people around you. But being a young person and going into mental health services can feel absolutely terrifying in places. There is still, to this day, so much stigma when it comes to mental health services, and particularly with things like eating disorders or with exercise addiction. There is still just a real lack of understanding around the people that have these problems. The fact that, yes, like we talked about at the start, people think you're choosing to be that way, that you're just being difficult, that you should just be able to eat, just be able to stop exercising. But if it was as simple as that, surely we would all just do it, switch it off when we could. When I arrived in that hospital for my assessment, I was so embarrassed about the fact that I had to go to a treatment centre that I didn't tell anyone at school where I was going. I made up this ridiculous excuse about why I wasn't in school that afternoon, got picked up by my mum at lunchtime, and headed off on my way. In my first appointment, I barely spoke to the clinician, not really wanting to engage in any sort of conversation. Eventually, in my second appointment, it was then that they diagnosed me with anorexia. I'd filled out a number of questionnaires in that first kind of session, looking at my relationship with food, exercise, and my body. But the problem with so many people with eating disorders is you don't really think there's anything the matter with you. And over the next 6 months, I continued to do what I was doing, continued to hide, continued to lie about all of these behaviors, constantly putting on that front, pretending that life's fine, everything's fine. And for me, I just could not deal with any of the emotional kind of repercussions of what was going on. So I just kept my head down and kind of kept doing what I was doing. But eventually, after 6 months at CAMS as an outpatient, there was nothing else that they could do for me. And I was admitted to a mental health hospital, where I then spent the next year of my life learning a lot about food, learning a lot about exercise. But the biggest thing for me was actually learning to just talk about things. So I'm not going to talk a huge amount about my time in treatment, but I do just want to say kind of a couple of things that really, really helped me get to that space where I was able to be discharged. So the first thing was accepting that I had an eating disorder, which is something that I mentioned a moment ago, is something that people find so, so difficult. I really, really struggled when I first went into treatment. I thought that people didn't understand me. I thought that no one really got it. And I was so angry the entire time at everyone around me. But on the Friday night, so after 3 days in treatment, one of the nurses came in to see me. She brought with her these massive pieces of paper. And she marked on one of the pieces of paper where my head was and where my feet were. And she got me to draw how I imagined myself. So I kind of knelt down on the floor and drew this life-size version of myself. Once I'd done that, she got me to lie down on that exact same piece of paper, and she traced around the outside of me. She then got me to stand up and look back down at those images. And they were just so, so different. I thought at first that she'd lied to me, that she'd somehow tricked me. But I had this realization then, there was something seriously wrong with the way that I viewed myself. And maybe there was something the matter with me. And it was this concrete evidence that I really, really needed to actually help me to realize that I needed to have that extra support. On that Friday night, I told myself that I would just start eating a little bit and see what would happen. But over the next couple of months, I really, really got stuck into therapy, stuck into my own recovery program. The thing about eating disorders is they're not about food. They're not about weight. They're not about your body image. They are serious mental illnesses, but you're using the food as a vehicle to express what's going on, a vehicle to numb a lot of those emotions. And my eating disorder was all about that kind of communication, that emotional aspect. There was huge amounts of kind of fears of rejection, fears of abandonment, fears of not being lovable, fears, again, that there was something wrong with me if people didn't get it. And I had to get to a space where I could be really, really vocal about all of this sort of stuff. And then the other thing that really helped when I was in treatment was trying to think of all of those reasons for wanting to get well. When you have an eating disorder, you think that you're totally invincible. You think that life will just carry on and that everything will be okay. And the really scary reality is there is so many people right now who are functioning at a high level with an unhealthy relationship with food, with their body, or with exercise. And perhaps because of society, we've kind of normalized this. We normalize this obsessive exercise, this calorie counting, these diets that people go on all the time. But at some point, we have to tackle this thing head on. And for me, it took ending up in treatment to realize there was so much other stuff that I actually wanted out of my life. I wanted to go to uni one day. I wanted to get a job. And a big thing for me is I want to have my own family one day. And none of this stuff would be possible unless I really started to work on my own recovery and really get to that space where I was able to function outside of a hospital and actually really start living my life. But the thing for so many people with eating disorders is that kind of fear of your body changing, this fear of people not understanding, this fear of actually feeling emotion again, can often keep people stuck and trapped in these situations for so long. For me, I had to make sure that on the other side of fear, there was this kind of exciting, bigger picture piece done so that I could just focus on that and realize that actually I could get to that point and it would be okay. It was risky to try and get there, but I just had to see whether it would be worth it. Ever since leaving treatment about 14 years ago, I've been in a state pretty much of ongoing recovery. There's been moments during that time when I thought I'd fully recovered, but there's also been moments when life has felt really, really challenging again. I think for so many people, not just with eating disorders, but generally in society, is we create these kind of belief systems for ourselves. these things that we kind of tell ourselves that if we eat a certain amount of food, or if we look a certain amount of way, that we'll be happier, that we'll be more content. And again, whilst those belief systems might seem harmless, for so many people, they keep them kind of stuck and trapped in that space. For me, over the last couple of years, I've really been kind of pushing for that final bit in my own journey of recovery, kind of pushing myself to break a lot of those belief systems, to really understand what is going on and get to the bottom of it. For so much of my life, the eating disorder served a purpose, giving me that sense of value, numbing a lot of those emotions, all of those things that I didn't want to feel. But actually, for me, once I began to really understand what that purpose it was doing was, yes, there might have been fear still there, but it helped me to really start to unpack it and step further and further forward. So whether you've had an eating disorder or not, or you're struggling with exercise or your own relationship with your body, there are a few things that you can really be thinking about when it comes to kind of managing your own well-being. So the first thing that I want to kind of look at is knowing what things currently trigger you. So every single person in life has these situations that trigger us, those things that stress us out, those things that cause us a huge amount of anxiety. Quite often when we're triggered by a situation, we might go to this kind of self-destructive like coping mechanism. We might try and numb the feelings that we've got, find that way to distract ourselves. And for me, so much of the time, I used to go back to that kind of restrictive thinking that if I just did that, then everything would be fine, that I'd get that short-term value. And that's what I really wanted in that moment. Now, when I'm triggered by a situation, yes, it does feel slightly uncomfortable and can feel slightly difficult to navigate, but I'm able to really understand again, like why I'm triggered and what can I do instead. For me, the way that I cope with my triggers now is to pretty much just talk about it. I will talk and talk and talk and try and dissect what exactly is going on, really giving myself that space to feel really heard and really understood. I'll also journal a lot, so kind of taking that time again to process that emotion. And if I feel like I'm in an okay frame of mind, I might also go for a walk with someone. Again, just having that space to kind of distract myself and talk about what's happened. I mentioned a moment ago about kind of belief systems. And again, I think all of us need to challenge these kind of beliefs that we have in our head, not just beliefs about food and exercise, but all of those ideals that society puts on us, challenging that thinking. You wouldn't judge your friend if they changed their way, or you wouldn't like them anymore if they lost weight. So maybe start to call yourself out on that as well, if you're kind of creating that narrative in your head. I'm also very mindful of what I look at on social media, so making sure that I'm only looking at content that is helpful. It isn't about just looking at these kind of positive hashtags all the time, but it's about flooding your feeds with kind of diverse, interesting, inspiring people that maybe, I don't know, are out there changing the world, people that maybe you look up to slightly, but making sure that it isn't just people with exactly the same bodies. I'm also very, very mindful of interrupting all of my negative thinking. I know that I have a tendency, if I've had a difficult day, to kind of go down this rabbit hole of negative thoughts, and I ruminate a lot. And by the time, I don't know, it gets to like 20 minutes of rumination, I'm then stuck in that moment that there's something wrong with me and that's my problem and I need to change. And for me now, it is about interrupting that thinking. So boldly saying something else. I think, yes, it would be amazing if all of us could interrupt that thought with a positive or something we loved about ourselves or something that we're good at. But sometimes it is just about trying to interrupt that thought. And if you really, really struggle to do that, it might be that you just have these go-to mantras in place in those moments when things feel slightly challenging. Getting to that space where maybe you can predict when your brain is going to start making life really, really difficult and predict what it might say, and thinking, actually, if I was really well, or if I was in a good headspace in that moment, how would I actually respond? What would my brain actually be telling itself to make myself feel better? So if there is anything that has come up for you guys today, I've put some kind of places on the screen that you can go to and get that initial support. I know how unbelievably difficult it is to talk about things, to admit that stuff's going on. I spent the majority of my childhood just not talking about things, pretending like life was fine, like everything was okay. But actually, we need to be finding the words to say. If you're someone who struggles to talk about things, It might be looking at organizations like The Mix, where they have a huge heap load of kind of blog posts up there, places that you can get some kind of guidance on maybe how to talk about things. Or you could read a blog and send that to a friend saying, actually, this is what's going on for me now. This is what I'm really, really struggling with. It's really, really important that we don't wait until we're kind of at this so-called crisis point. Every single person deserves to have that prompt intervention and that support when they need it. So if you've been feeling kind of a bit down for a couple of days, or anything that I've said today resonates, or if you feel guilty when you eat, or you're struggling with that belief system around exercise or food or your bodies, that is a sign that maybe you need to go and speak to, or maybe you need to get that support. And yes, like I said, services are so overstretched at the moment, it can feel like, what's the point? But actually looking at what other support is out there, looking at how people around you can support you, and maybe working that out, sending them an email and laying it out for them so they have that real understanding as well. So just quickly, just before I finish, I just wanted to highlight something that I'm currently working on. So I launched a campaign called Dump the Scales about 2 years ago. The reason that I launched the petition originally was because currently people with eating disorders are unable to get any sort of access and support on the NHS unless they are severely underweight. This is a complete injustice in itself. Eating disorders are not about weight. They're not about body. You cannot judge the severity based on someone's BMI, but yet we're still doing that on a day-to-day basis. It is a complete kind of postcode lottery as to whether someone gets treatment and support or whether someone doesn't. Every 62 minutes, someone dies because of an eating disorder, because of that lack of support, that lack of understanding, and because of the huge amounts of stigma that are out there. There are also millions more people who are functioning at a high level with an eating disorder, people who have the potential to spend the rest of their lives not able to access treatment or support and to just remain in that kind of functioning zone. This petition is all around making sure that people can access prompt interventions, regardless of what size you are, regardless of your age, your gender, your race, or your background. So far, the petition has over 100,000 signatures. It's been debated in Parliament a number of times. I took it to Downing Street just before COVID. And most recently, I've launched the kind of next phase of the petition alongside an economics report, looking at much more detail, actually, what can the government be doing? How can we really make sure the funding is going into services? And what would a good service really, really look like? It would be amazing if you could look at the petition, if you could sign it, if you could share it. And if you are particularly interested in this kind of thing, please do feel free to get in touch. I know at times kind of it can feel really overwhelming to try and support kind of campaigns and causes, and it can feel like, what's the point? But actually, there are things that we can all be doing to make sure that actually all of these people who've lost their lives to eating disorders, all of those families who are affected, all of those people who are still living with an eating disorder can really get the support and justice that they deserve. But thank you everyone for listening today. I hope you found it interesting and insightful. I've left my contact details on the screen, so if there is anything that's come up for you today, do feel free to reach out, to kind of get in touch, and I'm more than happy to have a little bit more of a conversation with you about it. But do also have a look at this kind of resources that are around you in your direct life. Look at your friends, your family, your kind of support network, and see whether there is someone that you can start to have one of these conversations with.